So we are live. Oh, hello everyone. Good morning for those that are in Brazil, and good night here in Australia. And good afternoon or evening for the audience in between these two countries. My name is André Luiz Cunha. I'm a professor at São Carlos School of Engineering, University of São Paulo. Welcome to another webinar in our second International Symposium in Transportation Engineering. This event is organized by both graduate programs in Transportation Engineering in the University of São Paulo at São Carlos and at São Paulo, a Polytechnic School. We are in our second week of lectures, and today is our first lecture for this second week. And our second week of lectures, and today we have a great pleasure to host as a speaker Patrícia Sauri Lavieri. She's Brazilian, graduate in civil engineer and master degree, both at the University of São Paulo, Polytechnic School, and she got her PhD at the University of Texas, Austin, United States, and now she's a lecturer in transportation engineering at the University of Melbourne, at the Melbourne School of Engineering. And Patrícia conducts research on urban transportation demand analysis and forecasting with emphasis on travel behavior modeling. Patrícia, thank you so much to be here with us and share your experience. It's a privilege to have you, first because of this difference of time. We are 14 hours ahead of Brazil, and so here is 11 p.m. So thank you for that. And second, and not recently, you had a baby, so we understand that you are taking care of your baby, and you had this time for our presentation. So thank you so much for your time for that. And for the audience, thank you everyone to join us, and please write down your questions on the YouTube chat, and after the presentation we will answer some of the questions. And so enjoy the lecture, and Patrícia, the microphone is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, André. Thank you, the committee, the organizing committee, for inviting me to do this presentation. It's an honor for me to be presenting to students from the University of São Paulo, both São Carlos and Poly. As André said, I'm a former Poly student, so it's really nice to be able to reconnect. And so I would like to thank again for this opportunity. Well, André already introduced me pretty well. So I'm currently a lecturer or assistant professor at the University of Melbourne. And I'm here today to talk about telework and daily travel. bringing a perspective from pre-pandemic to the automated vehicle era. When I was in Poly, I did my master's with Professor Orlando Strambi, and I started in 2012, and the topic of my master's was telework adoption and impacts on activity and travel patterns. So I'm kind of going back to that time a little bit, to being a little nostalgic, going back to this topic, because currently my research has evolved, and I'm studying more broadly impacts of information communication technologies on travel behavior, and also the impact of new transport technologies on travel behavior. So this presentation is kind of an opportunity to bridge what I did in the past with what I'm doing now, as well as with these unprecedented times that we are living and the whole world is experiencing, that is kind of a forced telework situation. So, is this familiar to you? I mean, I guess some time ago, none of us kind of knew what Zoom was. Maybe we were using some other softwares, and then very quickly we had to adapt, and we had to start using new softwares, which for me in the case was Zoom. It could be Google Classroom or Google and other softwares, but this very quickly became part of our everyday lives in the past month. For example, now this is probably having these meetings with a lot of people on Zoom is part of the work reality of so many of us, right? And this was not the case a couple of months ago. So what's happening? Is COVID-19 a massive experiment on telework? For example, I bring here some numbers to try to understand how telework adoption changed from before COVID to COVID situation. In Australia, for example, you can see that before COVID, 20% of workers would state that they would eventually occasionally work from home, and now during COVID, these numbers have reached to almost 40%. In the US, there are different numbers, but different statistics. But again, you know, two numbers from important sources say that between 40 and 60% of workers in the US started teleworking were teleworking during the COVID pandemic. In Brazil, the numbers for September are around 8 million people working remotely. And the proportions among workers with higher educations are the highest. So around 30% of all workers with higher education in Brazil are currently or were. I mean, I'm saying were. I'm talking in the past because things are changing in the past month, right? Restrictions are being lifted, so people are going back. Some people are stopping to telework and going back to their offices. So that's why I'm talking in the past. So then, frequently asked questions: as we experience this pandemic, we always start teleworking, and the statistics show that the number of people teleworking has significantly increased, or it's pretty large. What everybody's talking about is, well, will telework adoption last post-pandemic? And us from transport, we are also interested in, well, then if that's the case, and what are the impacts of telework on travel, and will this telework impacts on travel last post-pandemic? So what I'm bringing today is I'm going to do some analysis of telework adoption, to try to understand how we could address these questions, right? Nobody has answers to these questions, but we can start to see how we can think about these questions. First of all, I mean, I started talking about telework, but what is telework? And is pandemic telework the same as pre-pandemic telework? So, and actually measuring telework has been a challenge in the literature since the beginning, since the late 70s, early 80s, when it started being measured, being studied, because the definition of telework is very broad, and different things can be telework, can be telework. So how do you quantify something that is not very well defined? For example, telework could encompass different locations. Is any type of remote work telework? And by remote work, I mean away from the main workplace. Is work done from home telework, but then are all types of work done from home telework? Is work while traveling telework? The type of employment, should we consider self-employed individuals as teleworkers, people who are doing second jobs, pink-collar jobs? Pink-collar are caretakers, people who are doing actual remote long-distance work, so people who don't even have an actual workplace, office that they could go to. And should we call telework when people work all day outside from their main workplace, or is half a day also included in the count? Working overtime, replying to emails in your house, should all that be considered telework? I mean, it can, but when you're gonna quantify, you need to be more precise, right? You need to be clear about what exactly we're talking about. So in transport, the term that has been often used is actually telecommuting and not telework, because telecommuting implies the substitution of the commute travel by employees. So in this case, you already take, remove all of these occupations that would not have a main workplace, and you remove all those remote work activities that are not substituting for commute travel. So this can be the case in the analysis and in the quantification. And right now, in the COVID-19 scenario, telework is pretty much a synonym of work from home, which in many cases is also equivalent to telecommuting, but it's more strict than that, because it's for those whose main workplace was not home. Now they are at home. And those who maybe had a flexible work locations, now they are also at home. So it really, in this situation, is a synonym of work from home. In Brazil, people like to say home office, right? And having clarity in the definition of telework is important, not only to measure telework, but in transport to be able to measure what are the impacts of this remote work or on travel, right? So if you wanna, so I showed some statistics about what are the numbers of telework during the pandemic, and now let's have a look at how it was before. So here I have some data from the United States, and we can see that the amount of telework is actually pretty low. For example, if you use census data that asks what is your usual commute mode, you see that work at home is considered a commute mode, and it has increased from the 80s till now, but it's still around 5%. It's interesting to see that for the US, which is a pretty car-dominated country, this number is larger. It's currently larger than transit. Then if we look at some other numbers released by the census, and that has a more generic definition, right? That is people who did some work at home, then you have numbers around 25%. But then as you go to more strict definitions, exclusively at home, then it reduces to 15, and high frequency, that would be 3 or more times a week, then you have around 4% of the working population. And if you look in terms of time use, this is you see that the time that people spent conducting work activities in the workplace has been decreasing, and outside the workplace has been increasing, including in travel, right? So even more flexible than just working at home. So pretty much we see that people conducting some telework, the amount of people conducting some telework, right, not full on, has doubled both in Australia and in the US. Okay, so if we go back then to the first, so we saw some numbers, right, of how it has increased, and we see that there was a significant increase in telework adoption. So if we go back to the question, well, will telework adoption last post-pandemic? We can try to look at this problem using a social technical transition perspective, the multi-level perspective framework. In this framework is used to understand systems transition, and it says that there are multiple systems that are subsystems that interact with each other, and they go co-evolving over time. Social technical systems develop over many years, and they get in established regimes that are resistant to change. So that's what you see here in the center of the, I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, but that's what you see here in the center of the picture where it's written the social-technical regime, right? So in our case, it would be the standard workplace based work that we have been experiencing for a long time. So as time passes, the environment evolves, which is the landscape. So for example, information communication technology evolves, societal events occur, context changes. For example, now the pandemic, or in the future, autonomous vehicles. So these are exogenous variables that form the environment that interacts with this social technical regime that we are talking about, in our case, the work regime, right? But meanwhile, this regime keeps evolving over time. There are some minor collective practices. For example, small selected companies and groups that start adopting different work practices. And these practices start to grow, and maybe in a certain time, a window of opportunity is created that these minor collective practices gain enough power that they actually become part or substitute the regime, right? So in our cases, is coronavirus pandemic creating a big enough window of opportunity for telework really to take over and go from a minor collective practice to a major collective practice? So what we have is, yeah, we do have larger groups of people experiencing telework right now. But will this momentum be large enough to enable a new regime? That's the question that we are trying to answer, right? Well, that's not the first time that exogenous factors led to temporary telework adoption. For example, in many previous Olympics, individuals from the city that was hosting the Olympics were required to telework. In the US, telework has been used several times when earthquakes and hurricanes happened to try to minimize chaos, improve safety. It has happened. Telework has been promoted to alleviate the effects of strikes, especially strikes in public transport. So, but it has always been temporary adoption. People will adopt during the required time, but then companies will go back to their office-based work, right? What's different this time? Well, it's a lot larger, both in the temporal and in the geographic scale, right? I mean, we started our lockdowns in early March, and we are almost in November, and some cities, for example, Melbourne, where I am, is still in lockdown. So people are having to stick to it for a longer time. So maybe more time to adapt to it, right? At the same time, the geographic scale is a lot larger. It's a global scale. So it might be enough this time. But well, we don't know, and so to try to go a little deeper in that, and we can look at this system, right? The telework system that I was talking about, and look at its components to to try to see how their interactions between the main how the interaction between the main subsystems of the work activity are changing, as well as how their interaction with the environment, with the landscape, which means other systems, are changing as well. So the telework system can be is formed by three main components: the employer, the worker, and the technology. Right? The employer needs to allow the worker to conduct telework. The worker needs to want to telework, and the technology needs to be available to enable this work. And how much the employer or the worker will want to allow or will want to do telework depends a lot on their interaction with some other systems that are part of the environment. For example, the real estate market. If it's expensive to have offices and to have large office floors, then you might want to reduce the amount of floor space that you rent. So you might want to have some workers working remotely. If the labor legislation facilitates and protects workers doing telework, then workers might be more prone to teleworking. The job market also, it might be a good strategy for employers to avoid the high turnover rates, and for them to keep good employees, which are in high demand in the job market, for example. And also the transport system. And in specific, the level of service, right? If you live in São Paulo, for example, and you have extremely long commutes that take forever, that you spend hours to commute less than 10 kilometers, then you might want to consider not going to the office a couple of days per week. And now, with the pandemic situation, another external system that is having a major influence in the telework system is the public health, right? So because people need to avoid to be infected with or to infect others with coronavirus, then they have to stay home, and therefore this is forcing the relationship between employer and employee to work out the telework arrangement. Even more than that, with all this online learning and with the fact that you can't even meet clients, one could consider that clients and students become part of the central telework system as well. But we're gonna work with the more basic system here. So as I briefly mentioned earlier, for the telework choice to happen, it depends on both aspects of the worker, the employer, and the technology availability. So in terms of worker, it's the individual preference. So the individual needs to want to telework. And individual wanting to telework will depend on psychological factors. For example, how much they feel that they are able to, and that they are disciplined, and how they feel about being in their houses, and etc. Social and family factors. I mean, again, how you feel about being maybe isolated in your house, or if you have family, is the environment in your house really conducive to work? And that leads to home environment too. Do you have the right ergonomics to work from home? But also other activity and travel behavior, right? Because we are making decisions of where we go, of what we do, where and where, all jointly, right? We decide everything at the same time. Let's say I live in a very faraway suburb, and my office is in a central area, and I would have to go to the central area anyways to buy groceries. Then maybe telework doesn't make as much sense to me as it would make to another person that has groceries readily available close to their house. So how our other activities and travel are planned may also act as a motivator or as a constraint to my preference and desire towards teleworking. Well, usually individuals say that they do want to telework, but then in this case, what acts as restrictions is actually the option. I mean, how many individuals have the opportunity to telework? And that depends on job suitability. So what type of job you have. I mean, if you work with IT, information, or technology, then yes, it's easy. Probably your job is suitable for you to telework. But if you are a waitress, then that is not possible, right? So your job is not suitable for telework arrangements. The option also depends a lot on employer characteristics, and that has to do with management culture, how much employers believe that employees will do their work if they're not being closely supervised. And it's also a lot related to performance measurement. Is the employer still measuring time, or is the employer doing measurements more per task or project or actual deliverables, right? And also the technology availability, as I mentioned earlier. It's not only the technology existing, but as well as the company providing the adequate technology to the employee, and is the employee familiar enough to use it? And I think that has shown to be a challenge when you need to start teleworking last minute, like what happened with coronavirus, right? So the takeaway here is not all jobs are suitable for teleworking. Not everyone whose job is suitable wants to telework, has a preference. And not everyone whose job is suitable and wants is allowed to, has the option. Here is just a little joke. My manager is having trouble embracing the new telework policy. So here is somebody working in their house and their manager right there. And what I found back then in 2014 during my master's, when I interviewed a lot of companies, is that management culture is indeed one of the greatest barriers to telework adoption. Is it changing after coronavirus experience? Well, maybe it is. So how many people can work from home? We showed how many people are working during coronavirus. We showed how many people were working before coronavirus, but how many people could be working from home, right? How many people have jobs that are suitable for telework? Here I'm drawing the United States information heavily from Pat Mokhtarian's presentation, she made a very good presentation for the Inno Foundation. I really recommend you guys watching that. So there are different estimates, again, based on job in the US, between 40 and 56%. People could potentially telework. When you look for numbers of people who are allowed to, available, or eligible, this number already reduces a lot, but it's still fairly high, around the 20% based on the National Household Travel Survey. In Brazil, based on jobs, there is a recent estimate that was made by IPEA, following the same methodology that this 37% here from Dingyo and Neiman in the US is based on. So IPEA used the same methodology to make this estimate. And they estimate that almost 23% of the jobs in Brazil could be teleworked. In Australia, also following the same methodology, it was found that around 39% of all jobs in Australia could be teleworked. Well, so then when we compare these numbers with the numbers that we have during the coronavirus pandemic, we see that United States is pretty much reaching full potential, or the numbers are even larger than what's here as being potentially feasible. So maybe some jobs that are not traditionally teleworkable, they are finding some way of doing part of it, at least from home. Australia also seems to be in its full potential, while Brazil is more around 40% of the full potential. Okay, so we looked closely at the telework system, and then what's involved, how the different system components interact to allow for the telework choice to happen. So then what's happening differently during the pandemic? Well, during the pandemic, we don't really have a choice, right? Everybody's at home. If you can work, great. If you can't, you might be even losing your income, right? So it's pretty sad. So there is no choice. It's mandatory to those whose job was suitable. Oops, sorry. Companies are being forced to adopt. So whether your manager trusts you or not, it doesn't matter anymore. The manager just has to accept the situation and let the workers, the employees work from home. For the employees, they might be coping with more challenging conditions than they would if they were teleworking in a pre-pandemic situation, because right now we have all the families at home, all the kids are at home, there is no child care, so you need to be able to telework, sharing space with other people and maybe taking care of your kids at the same time. There was no time for technology and ergonomics to be adjusted in the individuals' houses, so they may be working in some precarious conditions. There is all the lockdown and social isolation, so in a regular telework situation, okay, maybe you don't see your coworkers, but you can go out and see your friends, and in this case, you are totally socially isolated. So the situation overall is more stressful, and also because of the new factor, the novelty factor, people might be working overtime too. Interaction with other active travel behavior is pretty much non-existent, because other active travel behavior is pretty much non-existent. So the perception of teleworking may be that it is less desirable than in normal conditions for the employee, which could result in reduced preference for it. So then once all that ends, what's gonna be people's preferences and people's choices? What is the future of telework choice? If you look at samples in the US, here again, the US data I'm extracting from Mokhtarian's presentation. So pretty much 60% of those who worked at home during COVID say that they would like to continue doing it as much as possible. While other numbers say occasionally. For Australia, 2 individuals state that they would like to telework 1 or 2 days a week. So you see that the preference is not for this full-time, full week working from home as is being experienced during the pandemic. In terms of companies, what are the companies' perspectives? In Australia, it seems that individuals are very keen to keeping remote work happening. So is there going to be a job market change? Well, maybe. The positive and negative experiences during the pandemic are influencing, are going to influence the future culture. And another thing that employers are now aware of how much savings they get in terms of space and utilities, so that might also be another motivation for them to continue with programs. In terms of Brazil, there are some results here too. And that's actually a very interesting study, because it's not showing only the positive side of it, but also the more negative side. So 67% of the companies say that they found it difficult to implement teleworking. And the difficulty with technology, with using technology and the communication technology, was perceived as a large barrier for companies. Still, 50% of the companies say that the experience with telework has been better than expected. And 34% is expecting to continue with teleworking, but you see that it's not for all employees, but around 1/4 of the employees. Okay, so I guess that was a good perspective on the adoption. So then we go to the impacts on travel So the coronavirus impacts on travel have been pretty substantial. Here I bring some statistics from Australia, and here in the bottom I have statistics from Florida, United States, and it's pretty much, reductions are pretty much between 40 and 50% in traffic volumes, and also very, very significant reductions in public transport usage, especially because of the social distancing that many times is not possible in public transport. The use of public transport has been very discouraged during this time, so you see decreases of around 70%. Here there are some numbers from Brazil in terms of traffic congestion. In São Paulo, we see a reduction of 80%. It's a massive reduction. And in terms of use of public transport, a reduction of 50% in São Paulo, also very, very significant. Well, how much of all those impacts on transport is due to telework? It's a question that is pretty much impossible to answer, and I have tried to find some estimates from people, and I didn't find any. Nobody is willing to guess at this point. But also because it's, as we discussed earlier, it's very difficult to measure due to drastic changes in overall individual activity and travel behavior. It's not only working from home, is not being able to do anything outside your house, is being complete lockdown. And also, as I mentioned earlier, the public health concerns, they not only lock people inside their houses, but they also forced some mode shifts. So, for example, public transport has been declining drastically, and automobile being a little more encouraged, but the use of bicycles showing to have like an exponential growth too. Well, so if we can't measure what were the impacts of telework in this massive decrease in traffic during the pandemic, what is the impact of telework on travel outside a pandemic scenario? Well, this is even more difficult to measure. First, it depends on the definition of telework, as we said earlier, right? Because it might involve the substitution of a commute trip or not. So when we are studying the impacts of information communication technology on active travel behavior, we usually talk about 6 main effects. And these are of substitution. In this case, telecommuting would be substitution, right? You completely remove the trip to and from work for an activity that is conducted virtually using ICT. So that's substitution. Complementarity is when you use ICT to conduct a certain activity, for example, online shopping, but that also increases the amount of your in-person shopping. Modification is when ICT just changes your in-person activity. So, for example, part-time telework, let's say you work from your house in the morning, and then in the afternoon you go to the office. That would be a modification because you are just changing the time that you travel to and from work. Neutrality is if there is no change at all. And then there is also spatial-temporal fragmentation, which means you get an activity that you used to have to be conducted in a specific location, for example, your workplace, and now this activity can be conducted at different points. For example, if you have a computer, you can go and work in a coffee shop. And then the temporal fragmentation is, well, you can do a little bit of this activity now, and then you pause for something, do something else, and then you do a little bit more of that activity. You don't need to do it in a continuum of time. And also multitasking, which would be, if you are teleworking while traveling, for example, that would be considered multitasking because you are doing 2 activities at the same time. So if you consider that telework and different definitions of telework can have all these different types of impacts, imagine how difficult it is to measure what is the resulting net impact on transport, right? As I touched on it a little bit earlier too, the engagement on digital and out-of-home activities of multiple purposes are decided jointly. So yeah, I mentioned that when I was explaining the choice to telecommute and how that might depend on other active travel commitments that you have. For example, if you decide to work from home, you might also decide to buy your groceries online, and then since you spent all day at home, you decide that you're gonna go jog in the park, and then you're gonna go buy some juice or have a drink. While if you go to the office for work, you might decide that during lunch you're gonna go out and go to the gym. On the way back from work, you're gonna stop and buy groceries. So you are really making these decisions jointly. So once you add the telework component, it's really hard to separate what is the net telework effect on your activity travel behavior. For example, some jointness examples from my previous research. In my master's, I observed that the need to chauffeur kids to school resulted in longer distance travel during teleworking days for a person in my sample. And that's because his kids' school was close to his office because it made sense for him. And now that he was teleworking 2 times a week, he was actually doing 4 trips a day, right? He was going to drop off the kids and going back home, and then in the end of the day, he was going to pick up the kids and then going back home, and that was increasing a lot his distance traveled. And that shows how looking at telecommuting in isolation or even planning telecommuting or teleworking as a transport demand management strategy in isolation without looking at land use may be useless. As I mentioned earlier, if people live in suburbs and they need to travel longer distances to go buy groceries and do other activities, the telework alone might not solve much. And also the importance of telework frequency, because low frequencies may not allow the individual to optimize active location choice. In another study, I observed that this other study we are modeling jointly the impact of digital accessibility on different types of activity purposes. And we observed that individuals that work from home, they also reduce the number of out-of-home maintenance activities, and those are shopping activities. So because they are probably optimizing, trying to reduce their maintenance activities since they are not going out to work, right? It's very convenient to leave your office and stop in the grocery store. So if you don't go to the office, you might be also reducing the number of trips to the grocery store. And we also observed that online shopping reduces trip chaining, and when you reduce trip chaining again, you have more back and forth. So single destination tours. so that increases your overall distance traveled. Another aspect that is important is the indigeneity of long-term decisions. And this is a question that is being asked since the 90s. Do individuals with long commute distance opt to telecommute, or do telecommuters opt to live farther from their workplace? And I mean, we still don't have an answer to that. It's probably a mix of both, right? So even though there are the more obvious substitution effects of telecommuting that would ideally reduce travel, there are all these other indirect effects that indicate that the potential of telework reducing travel is not that obvious. So the takeaway from all that, I think I'm talking for a very long time. Yeah, the takeaway from all of that is that, well, of course, teleworking numbers are likely to increase when compared to a pre-pandemic scenario, but probably numbers will be much lower than during the pandemic. Let's say, looking to the US, the number we had of 5%, I mean, we might double to 10%, but it's still not, it's not that everybody's or all the 40% that could be doing it are gonna be doing it. The previous experience tells that the bump will decrease over time, which means it might even, so now we are at 40%, over time it might decrease to 30, 20, 10, and maybe back to 5. But what I also believe is happening, which might maybe sustain a little bit more of teleworking, is that, and also that the pandemic is showing us, is that the nature of jobs is changing. And I think that people not only had to adapt to telework, but some jobs had to change the actual nature. For example, teaching and learning, right? Teaching online is a whole different experience. And also with the gig economy and more contract working happening, it may be that together with the pandemic experience will sustain higher levels of telecommuting, but probably still lower than what we just saw. While teleworking during pandemic meant 5 days a week of work at home, after pandemic, lower frequency schemes are much more likely to prevail, and not necessarily telecommuting, which means not necessarily the substitution of commute travel. It might be a more fluid and fragmented. So here the concept of spatial temporal fragmentation that I mentioned earlier might be more what we observe, people conducting work in different places and different times. While high frequency schemes may be more beneficial to employers who can save more in office and utilities, but people are social beings, and it's unlikely that offices are going to be completely extinct. The impacts on travel, well, we don't know how much was due to telework during the coronavirus pandemic, but any impact, I would say, is unlikely to be sustained. And going back to my previous slides, people will readjust, and we are social beings, and we want to be outside, and we want to do different things. So it's not likely that travel will decrease drastically. Well, but then on top of that, what if this massive telework experiment does trigger a greater flexibility in work location and time. So, okay, it's not that we are all going to be working from home 5 days a week, but now we have a better understanding of our ability of using information communication technologies to conduct work in different places during different times. So what if the consequence of the pandemic is actually that is us understanding that work can be more fluid in space and time? Well, then, if you pay attention to the title of my presentation, I have not mentioned anything about autonomous vehicles, automated vehicles up to this point, but that's when automated vehicles come into play, right? And that's because if you have work activities that are fluid on space and time, then in autonomous vehicle situation, your ability to travel might increase a lot. So here we have this figure that my PhD student made, Yutong. Need to acknowledge him. And this is an example of Hargestrand space-time prism. So we have a situation A, which represents an individual that has a traditional workplace-based work arrangement. And it's traditional not only in terms of location, but also in terms of time, right? So if you need to be in your office between 8 and 6, then there is so much budget of time left for you to travel and go and to travel to more distant places and go do other activities. Here in situation B, you have a flexible work arrangement, so you don't need to be working from 8 to 6, and you don't need to be working in your office necessarily. So, and you might be able to work while you commute if you take public transport and if the level of service is good enough for that. So maybe your prism is the coverage area in your prism is going to be larger, or you're going to have the opportunity to do more activities. But then in the third scenario, that is in the future, this might go to another level, as you might be inside a comfortable self-driving vehicle, and you might do the majority of your work while inside this vehicle. And so then your time budget will increase a lot, and you are able to go farther and do more activities, and maybe you are willing to spend more time traveling. So in sum, when we think of private autonomous vehicle ownership's impact on travel, we think that there is the opportunity of meaningful use of travel time. And what meaningful use of travel time does is that it reduces your value of travel time savings, right? So it increases your acceptability of traveling. So you might be willing to either travel for longer distances, or even you might be less sensitive to congestion. You might want to live farther, so you might accept longer commutes and all that. And considering that work is the most constraining activity that people usually do during their days and during their weeks, right? That's what we do from Monday through Friday. Once this is not fixed in space and time, and once you don't need to drive and you can do that while traveling indefinitely, that could lead to catastrophic increases in congestion and energy consumption. Of course, that is an extreme scenario that I'm mentioning, but it's just to show how there is some potential. So, in other words, in long term, the ability to telework while traveling can actually increase distance traveled. So all those positive impacts, they could actually work the other way around in an autonomous vehicle future. So this is more of a provocation than answer to questions, I'd say. Here are some of my references, and thank you. I'll open for questions right now.
Okay, Patrícia, thank you for this fascinating presentation, especially because the issue that is definitely what we are living nowadays with this pandemic scenario, and brings all this telework and technology to use, and especially in terms of the consequence in the traffic. And it's good to see that we had during your presentation we had some peaks of 60 people watching on YouTube, so it was a good audience for you. Most of people from the University of São Paulo, both in São Paulo and São Carlos. Now we had some questions here that we can try to manage, and you can respond that. Even that we are on Tuesday in Australia, so let's try to answer some of these questions. The first one is from Samuel Marks regarding the graphic that shows the change in telework share. Did this change take place during the pandemic? And he said that he noted that the teleworking share exceed that of transit. What could be the reason for that?
Well, I think that the graph that he's referring to is actually census data, and that is data from the US, and it's showing that the number of people who state that they work from home, that their commute mode is actually working from home, is higher than the number of people who usually commute by transit. So this is a pre-pandemic situation, and as I said, it's United States data, and the reason for such low share of public transport in the US is the fact that it's an extremely car-dominated environment. Mm-hmm. But here in Australia, I mean, if we are experiencing 70% reduction in public transport use and 40%, it's not an increase, it's a total share. But so, I don't know, but I mean, I do expect that there is a large decrease in public transport use. I mean, there is a large decrease in public transport use, as we are seeing. And that's not only because people are working from home, but also because public transport is being discouraged because of the social distancing recommendations of 1.5 meters and etc. So.
Let's see, another one is from Annalisa. Telehealth is now becoming a reality in my field. She's a physiotherapist, and currently we are investing in telerehabilitation and its impacts on patient and physiotherapist lives. Consider that both physiotherapists and patients could stay at their home. Is there any possibility that this new model of delivery of care could lead to any level of impact on the traffic congestion and alleviate the number of vehicles in major cities like São Paulo?
That's very interesting. because maybe in this case, let's say that both the doctor and the patient, both of them, they were going to travel to the hospital or to the office, right? So you are actually decreasing the number of trips for 2 people instead of 1 for a single activity. But I think that for that to reach the point of being able to observe aggregate impacts on traffic congestion, I don't think that the overall share of trips for health purposes would lead to that. Maybe in local areas around hospitals or areas that have traffic congestion because of because of these specific trips. Yeah, so it would be very localized rather than a major impact. And again, it's important to think about, well, how were these trips being chained before, and whether they are maybe they were part of a very efficient trip chaining, and so then actually removing these trips is not doing any good or making any difference to traffic.
Yeah, and comment about this is, you mentioned about that it's difficult to measure this, the pre-pandemic and nowadays. So of course nowadays we have the problem, so we are looking for some solution. But the measure that you will compare, and of course we don't have the measure before, so then it's difficult to analyze and to have some answers for this problem.
Yeah, doing the before and after is very difficult. What usually is done in telecommuting studies is that usually individuals do not telecommute every day. And so one strategy was to compare days where people telecommute, in which people telecommute, with days in which people do not telecommute. So most of the studies in the field, have used this strategy actually, but again, it has its flaws.
Yeah. Next question from Alceu. Different countries dealt differently with the pandemic. Do you think that more intensive restrictions lead to greater opportunity windows to teleworking and therefore changes in travel behavior?
That's a very, very good question, and I'm gonna answer it based on our personal experience here in Melbourne. I think Melbourne is one of the cities with the longest lockdown in the world, even though if you look at the number of cases here, it is pretty low compared to many other places in the world. So I do believe that people have had more time to adapt to telework, so they are probably getting more efficient at it. So maybe people are getting more productive and are learning better how to deal with it. But on the other hand, the social isolation, having to have your kids homeschooling, and all these other things that came together with it, I would say that they might make teleworking less interesting than it should be. And in terms of change in travel behavior, I also think that people are now in a desperate situation. Again, I'm not talking technically at all. I'm talking personal experience and from reading the news here, that people really want to get out and people really want to travel. So for example, we're going to be allowed to travel for more than 25 kilometer radius of our houses. And I saw on the TV that all hotels in the state are red booked. So people are desperate to do long distance travel. So now people are valuing
go far from home.
Yeah, again, that might be just the immediate effect. So, okay, now we might see a peak on long distance travel, and then as people get satiated, then it could get back to normal situation, and then teleworking could show something. So yeah, I think it's a difficult question, but longer restrictions, I think, can work both ways, either both in the positive and in the negative. I don't know if I answered your question, but
the next one from George Obirajara. What kind of survey design strategies would you suggest to effectively measure these effects without significantly increasing response burden?
Oh, that's also a good question. So in my master's, it was 2013, and I tried to convince people to install an app in their smartphones and let me track them for 7 days. And I ended up with a sample of 10 people. So I got very good data, but a very small sample. So I guess there are some trade-offs there. It's very, very difficult to measure retrospective things. I mean, as soon as all that started, I at least started receiving invitations for surveys, because people wanted to get exactly this before and after effect, right? And really learn how people were traveling right before the pandemic started, and then as soon as it started. So yeah, I think that the user burden is there, and it's not only the user burden, because you're going to need to ask people to recall a lot of things and enter a lot of details, but it's also the bias of forgetting, right? Because you're going to need to collect retrospective data unless you did it in a very timely manner. So I don't have a specific recommendation. I guess you do the best you can do, and you need to be aware of that when you analyze your data and model your data and draw your conclusions.
Another question for Elaine. First, she thanks for the great presentation, and it was interesting to see data you showed from both Australia and Brazil, so that we could compare them. In Brazil, there is an estimated that 25% of people do not have access to the internet. Focusing on transport, I believe these people are the ones who are more access public transport. Do you think if there is such a correlation between them?
I'm not sure I completely understood the question, but yes, I do believe that there is a correlation between public transport use and lack of access to internet.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also true that most people who do not have the opportunity to telecommute, to telework, even in a pandemic situation, are those who also do not have access to cars, right? To private, to individual transport. So it's very problematic, because people who drive to work, so during their travel, they are not exposed to the virus, or they're not in risk of contamination. These people who drive to work, they are able to telecommute, so they are safe 2 times, because people who have to still commute, during the pandemic situation, they are the ones who are using public transport. So that just increases the risk of contamination, right? So, yeah.
Okay. More two questions from Eric Tokuda. I suppose average commute time of a region is correlated with the preference of its dwellers on keeping their work as telework. What are the difficulties on measuring such a thing?
Yes, I mean, usually when you are modeling the choice to telework, you use as an explanatory variable commute time or commute distance. But depending on your cross-sectional data, you don't really know if the person, what was the initial choice. Yeah, you don't know if commute distance came after telework or telework came after commute distance. So you don't know in which sequence the individual chose that. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, the last one from...
yeah, okay, go
sorry.
ahead. No, go ahead.
The last one from Ellen, regarding the multi-level perspective framework, how can we identify if the momentum is large enough for promoting a transformation?
I mean, yeah, that's a good question. That's exactly what we are trying to find out.
Yeah.
And I think that just time will tell at this point.
Mm-hmm. So the Professor Adalberto, our representative from the graduate program in São Carlos, he thank you, Patrícia, for your excellent presentation and for the time you dedicated to us. So we don't have any more questions. And again, I thank you so much for your time and to share everything, especially because you came from the University of São Paulo, and now we spread for the United States and then now to Australia. And it's good to see and maybe motivate some of our students that we can go outside and have some experience and maybe work outside as well. So it's good to see and have this experience.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I mean, if people are interested in doing their PhD in Australia, shoot me an email. I mean, we can start talking if you're interested in these topics, or you can Google me or look at my webpage in the university website and see my fields of research. And I'm more than happy to facilitate scholarships and etc. to bring more students and give more students the opportunity to go abroad and learn from different places. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Mm-hmm.